Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com with another astonishing story of climate propaganda. The press is reporting today it's 70 degrees warmer than normal in eastern Antarctica. Scientists are flabbergasted. The coldest location on the planet has observed an episode of warm weather this week unlike any ever observed. With temperatures over the eastern Antarctic ice sheet soaring 50 to 90 degrees above normal, the warmth has smashed records and shocked scientists. And they show this bright red cherry over East Antarctica, ripe for the picking. This event is completely unprecedented and upended our expectations about the Antarctic climate system, said Jonathan Willey, a researcher studying polar meteorology at the University of Grenoble. Antarctic climatology has been rewritten, tweeted Stefano Di Battista, a researcher who has published studies on Antarctic temperatures. He added that such temperature anomalies would have been considered impossible and unthinkable before they actually occurred. Then the article went on, virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. The first problem with this article is that there's no such thing as a normal temperature. There's an average temperature, but the variation from year to year on the same date tends to be tremendous. I'm going to detail the other problems with this article in a minute, but first I want to point out that Grenoble has fantastic pizza. Part of my work time in 1999 was spent in Grenoble. They have something like 27 pizza restaurants downtown. If you get a chance to go to Grenoble, I definitely recommend their downtown pizza. And I'll never forget Jean-Claude Killy winning all 3 skiing events in the 1968 Winter Olympics. Now let's go back to our regularly scheduled program. Let's take a look at the actual science. In this image from the University of Maine, you can see that bright red cherry over eastern Antarctica. It makes it look like Antarctica is burning up and melting down. But the actual temperatures there are extremely cold, minus 30 Celsius. What's happening is there's a large high pressure system which is making temperatures warmer than average. Last winter was the coldest on record in Antarctica. For some reason they forgot to mention that in the new article. Satellites show that there's been no warming in the southern polar regions for the last 40 years. During Admiral Byrd's 1939 to 1941 Antarctic expedition, they recorded temperatures close to 0 degrees Celsius in the South Polar region. But this article claimed that minus 12 Celsius was a record. Had they actually done any research, they would have known that it was much warmer there 80 years ago. And if we go back even further, there are coal deposits in Antarctica from a time when their climate was very temperate. Explorer Stephenson said, "The snow buried the vegetation, killed the animals, and made the continent the most nearly dead in the world." The claim in the new article that minus 12°C is unprecedented warmth is patently absurd. We already saw that there's been no warming since the late 1970s in the southern polar regions. The authors in the article are ignoring 40 years of data and instead cherry-picking a single region and a single time period. Now let's look at another aspect of the incompetence of climate academia. In 1988, experts from the United Nations predicted 10 degrees warming. They missed their 10-degree prediction by exactly 10 degrees. NASA's leading expert James Hansen predicted 8 degrees Celsius warming for Antarctica. He missed that forecast by 8 degrees Celsius. Gavin Schmidt is in charge of temperature records at NASA now. In 2004, he published this article. During recent decades, surface temperatures decreased significantly over most of Antarctica. And NASA published this map in 2005 showing Antarctica cooling. But that didn't suit the climate agenda, so by 2009 the temperature record of Antarctica was completely rewritten by scientists. They turned the strong cooling trend into a red-hot warming trend. The same fraud which government climate scientists repeat over and over again. In 2015, NASA's Jay Zwally said that Antarctica was gaining ice. And in 1989, he said the same thing about Greenland. He said it was gaining ice at a rate of about 9 inches a year. Other scientists reported at the same time that Antarctica was also gaining ice. This article from the Washington Post was titled, "Global Warming Forecasts Are Cooling." But journalists and academics weren't going to make any money off the truth, so they canceled reality. Climate expert Bernie Sanders says Antarctica is melting 3 times faster than it was just 10 years ago. Climate change is real, very real. The data says otherwise, but if Bernie says so, it must be true. Now let's go back to another Antarctic scam from 45 years ago. Ross Ice Shelf, Antarctica. A huge portion of the Antarctic ice mass appears to be collapsing into the sea in a catastrophe that within 3 centuries could raise the levels of the world's oceans by almost 20 feet. That sounds pretty scary, except that it's been going on for hundreds of years. In 1932, it was reported that the Ross Ice Shelf had retreated 30 miles since it was first seen and surveyed by James Ross. The Ross Ice Shelf has been retreating very rapidly for centuries. But in order for climate scientists to get funding, they have to come up with a scary story. It doesn't make any difference whether or not it's true. In 2004, the UK government's chief scientist, Sir David King, said everybody was going to have to move to Antarctica. He said that the rest of the world was simply going to get too hot for humans to survive. And in 2008, a climate change study predicted refugees fleeing to Antarctica. There seems to be just about no limit to the climate nonsense from the press and government. Now let's look at some more nonsense from the original article. Sea ice over Antarctica just shrank to its smallest on record. There's no sea ice over Antarctica. The sea ice surrounds Antarctica. They link to this article from the Washington Post. Antarctic sea ice recently reached its lowest concentration on record, falling below 2 million square kilometers for the first time in 43 years of satellite observations. The Washington Post author has no clue what they're talking about. Concentration is measured in percent. If the author knew what he was talking about, he would have said extent rather than concentration. And then he went on to claim that we only have 43 years of satellite observations, which would have gone back to 1979. But in 1976, National Geographic published this satellite imagery of Antarctica. In late January, high summer at the South Pole, sea ice barely fringes the landmass. There was almost no sea ice around Antarctica during the summer of 1976, which was near the peak of the Ice Age scare. The Washington Post claimed there was no satellite imagery before 1979, but we went to the moon in 1969 and had lots of excellent satellite imagery during the 1970s. Everything in the original article was nonsense, but now let's take a look at what's wrong with their fundamental science. Here's how the greenhouse effect works. Energy from the sun warms the earth. Some escapes back into space, and some is held by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So you have to have sunlight warming the earth in order to get a greenhouse effect. But there's almost no sunlight near the South Pole this time of year. In a few hours, the sun will set at the South Pole and be gone for the next 6 months. There's almost no sunlight hitting the South Pole now, so there can't be much of a greenhouse effect. And almost all of the sunlight which does reach Antarctica reflects off of the very white snow cover. The greenhouse effect is almost non-existent at the South Pole, which is why it's so cold there. This article is complete nonsense. It's not record warmth, and the warmth they're having has nothing to do with global warming. There's been no warming in the southern polar regions over the last 40 years. Day in and day out, academics, politicians, and journalists are misinforming the public about almost every topic. Toto's been calling these scamsters out for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.